Poetry is a form of writing in which imagination, emotion, and fancy predominate. Dr. Johnson calls poetry a metrical composition and points out four elements of poetry: pleasure, truth, imagination, and reason. Shelley defined poetry as the expression of imagination. Coleridge thought poetry was the antithesis of science. Wordsworth defined it as the breath and finer spirit of all knowledge. T.S. Eliot calls poetry the vehicle of feeling and insists that poetry has to give pleasure. Poetry can be regarded as the interpretation of life through imagination and feeling. There are different types and forms in poetry. Subjective and objective poetry. Subjective poetry or personal poetry is the poetry of self expression. In this kind of poetry, we find mostly the poet's own feelings and thoughts given expression in a lyrical manner. Objective poetry is the poetry that expresses the world outside the poet. In this kind of poetry, the poet goes out of himself, mingles with the action and passion of the world, and expresses what he observes there. The lyric. Lyric poetry in its original meaning was poetry composed to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. The lyre was a simple Greek musical instrument, and the Greek idea of the lyric suggests its intimate connection with music. A lyric is defined as a poem that expresses a single emotion. Over elaboration of emotion results in the loss of effectiveness, so a lyric is generally short. In lyric poetry, the poet is occupied with himself. The lyric becomes a mirror to his personality. But it is difficult to identify the I in a lyric poem. Though the poet expresses his own emotions and feelings, they are also universal. For example, Milton's sonnet on his blindness expresses universal emotions. Most of the Elizabethan songs, poems of the metaphysicals like Donne, and the short poems and dramatic monologues of Browning and Tennyson comes under the category of lyric. The ode. The ode may be defined as a rhymed lyric, often in the form of an address, generally dignified or exalted in subject, feeling, and style. An ode usually begins with an address to somebody or something. For example, Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, Wordsworth's Ode on an Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, and Coleridge's Dejection and Ode. The sonnet. Sonnet is a lyric in 14 lines in an iambic pentameter governed by certain prescribed rules in general and in the arrangement of the rhymes. It derives its name from the Italian sonetto, which means a little song or sound sung to the strain of the music. Sonnets were first written in Italy in the latter half of the 13th century. This form of composition is associated with the name of Petrarch, though the form had been used even by Dante before him. A Petrarchan sonnet is composed of two parts: the octave comprising the first 8 lines and the sestet comprising the last 6 lines. The sonnet was introduced in England by Wyatt and Surrey in the 16th century. They discarded the Italian form and adopted a new rhyme scheme. The Elegy. An elegy is a melancholic poem in which the poet laments the death of a subject. The ballad is a simple narrative poem in short stanzas telling a story. It may be called a short story in verse. An epic is a long narrative in verse on a great and serious subject related in an elevated style. An epic tells a generally well known story and is centered around a heroic or semi divine figure on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe, a nation, or the human race.